as more and more Jewish people from Eastern Europe, little by little, started moving to Palestine, inspired by Zionism. And then part of why they were moving more and more to Palestine instead of coming to the US was because in the 1920s, the US imposed, as you said, stringent immigration restrictions. And then moving into the 1930s with the rise of Hitler and the United States had kind of closed the doors on immigration, more and more Jews from Eastern Europe were moving to Palestine. And so for Jewish American labor leaders, even though they ideologically were never aligned with Zionism, they sympathized with this growing Jewish community in Palestine, and they wanted to find ways to help and support them. And not only that, but also sometimes funneling money from the CIA to foreign worker organizations. A great example is in Chile. The history, right? I talked about how the US labor movement has always been one of the strongest supporters of the state of Israel and of Zionism for over a century now. And so in that context, the calls for a ceasefire are significant because it shows the beginning, it kind of cracks in the foundation of this longstanding support for Israel.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have Professor Jeff Schuhrke. He is a labor historian, journalist, and assistant professor at School of Labor Studies at SUNY Empire State University in New York. Professor Schuhrke, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
We had Professor Richard Wolff recently, and we discussed the history and the contemporary moment of the waves of unionization that is going on within the organized labor sections in the US. I thought this is a great moment to discuss the US labor movement and its complicated relationship with US imperialism in general, but specifically Zionism and the state of Israel. So, can we start with a little bit of history? You start your piece at Jacobin discussing the early immigrants being non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, and that began to change as US stringent immigration laws and the rise of Nazism pushed more and more people into Palestine. Can you revisit that history for us?
Yeah, of course. So you mentioned there is this long and complicated and I think kind of disturbing history of US labor's complicity with US imperialism. Um, the history of US labor's relationship with Zionism and the state of Israel is related, but it's sort of a separate kind of history on its own. So to start talking about that, answering your question about how Zionism as a movement really began in the late 1800s in Eastern Europe among Jewish communities mainly in the Russian Empire, where they faced a lot of discrimination and poverty and persecution. And so many, millions of Jews left Eastern Europe and went to the United States. They were working class people. Many of them went to work in the U.S. garment industry, manufacturing clothing and hats and shoes and all kinds of stuff like that. And they built up. They were working in really horrible conditions. This is where the word sweatshop first originated, with sweatshops there in New York City and other parts of the U.S. And a lot of the people working there were these young Jewish immigrants, and many of them they ended up forming trade unions, very kind of visionary, dynamic, powerful unions that, in a lot of ways, rejuvenated the U.S. labor movement at the time.
Were they part of the IWW at the moment?
Some were involved in the IWW, but the unions I'm particularly talking about are like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and Amalgamated Clothing Workers, which the ILGWU was part of the American Federation of Labor, the mainstream, labor federation. The Amalgamated Clothing Workers was an independent union that eventually was one of the founding members of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, that was very powerful in the 1930s and 40s during the period of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, the New Deal, World War II, and all of that. But So these Jewish immigrant workers were largely not part of the Zionist movement. Back in Russia, before they came to the U.S., they had been part of a socialist organization called the Jewish Labor Bund, which was, well, as I said, a socialist organization that saw Zionism as a movement of more middle and upper class people, and a nationalist movement that was didn't really focus on class struggle as the most important issue. So there wasn't, within the early Jewish American labor movement, there was not a very strong Zionist current that was seen as something, again, more for middle class Jews. But as more and more Jewish people from Eastern Europe, little by little, started moving to Palestine, inspired by Zionism. And then part of why they were moving more and more to Palestine instead of coming to the US was because in the 1920s, the US imposed, as you said, stringent immigration restrictions. And then moving into the 1930s with the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in Germany, and having a lot of influence in Central Europe, and eventually, invading Eastern Europe. Uh, and of course, the Nazis were completely anti-Semitic and wanted to totally expel and eventually exterminate Jewish people in Europe. And since the United States had kind of closed the doors on immigration, more and more Jews from Eastern Europe were moving to Palestine. And so for Jewish American labor leaders, even though they ideologically were never aligned with Zionism, they sympathized with this growing Jewish community in Palestine, and they wanted to find ways to help and support them. And so U.S. unions, not only the Jewish-led ones, but also non-Jewish-led U.S. unions slowly through the 1930s and 40s, were donating millions of dollars to Jewish labor organizations in Palestine, particularly the Histadrut. Histadrut is often talked about as the Israeli Labor Federation. And it is in some ways, it is, a union federation, but it's a lot more than that. Especially historically, it's been a lot more than that. Histadrut also was trying to create a whole economy in Palestine before the founding of the State of Israel. So Histadrut created hospitals and banks and cooperatives, farms, and every other kind of institution to build up an economy that was meant to absorb the incoming Jewish immigrant population, settler population. But also the Histadrut was fundamentally racist from the beginning, because it was all about excluding the indigenous Palestinian Arab population, and it was only meant to be to benefit all of the unions and enterprises, banks and healthcare clinics and schools and everything else, housing developments that the Histadrut was building, was only meant for the incoming Jewish settler population. And Histadrut received millions of dollars in donations from the U.S. labor movement. And then finally, in 1948, when the State of Israel was founded, U.S. unions this was at the time when the U.S. labor movement was probably at its most powerful in history, the middle of the 20th century, this period right after World War II. And so the U.S. labor leaders were using their influence and power in that moment to put pressure on the U.S. government to quickly recognize the new State of Israel and to support the State of Israel, provide loans and economic aid to Israel. And the U.S. government did do that by and large. And then in the first decades of the State of Israel, the 1950s and 60s and 70s, U.S. unions continued giving more money to Histadrut, money to the Israeli government, as well, particularly by buying State of Israel bonds, direct investments into the actual state, money used for infrastructure projects, to build roads and to build water-powered or irrigation systems and bridges and things like that. And U.S. labor, through union dues, pension funds, healthcare funds, was purchasing hundreds of millions of dollars in these State of Israel bonds. And I can't think of any other example of any other country in the world that US unions are so invested, financially invested in. It's only the State of Israel. Um, and also in Israel's earliest decades, it was frequently at war with the neighboring Arab states, with Egypt, with Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. And every time that happened, US labor leaders were very quick to come out and publicly support Israel, say we stand with Israel, to pressure the US government to send, weapons and support to Israel, holding big rallies of union members in the US expressing their support for Israel. Um, and one example that comes to mind in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon and laid siege to the city of Beirut for several weeks, and received widespread international condemnation because the civilian population of Beirut was suffering under this siege. And at that moment, when Israel was doing this and facing all this criticism for invading a neighboring country, laying siege to its capital city, killing hundreds of civilians, maybe thousands of civilians, the AFL-CIO, the main labor federation in the US, the executive council, the leadership of the AFL-CIO, took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. And in this ad, they put in all capital letters, the AFL-CIO is not neutral. We support Israel. So that's just a snapshot of the historical relationship between US labor and Israel. In many ways, the US labor movement, US unions helped to quite literally construct the state of Israel, to build it from the ground up, and constantly providing political support, financial support. And knowing this history, now in recent months, as unions start to speak up and call for a ceasefire in Gaza, and some rank and file union members in the US criticize Israel, they criticize the occupation. There are people, critics, who say, why are US unions speaking about this issue at all? What does this have to do with US unions? And knowing this history, it has a lot to do with US unions, because the US labor movement has always been very much involved in everything that's been happening in Israel and Palestine.
How much of the leadership within the AFL-CIO was Jewish Zionist per se, and how much of that was even non-Jewish labor leaders towing that line?
Yeah, very, very few of them were actually Jewish. And the ones that were Jewish, at least in the 1940s, 50s, this kind of period when the state of Israel was first founded, even the Jewish labor leaders still consider themselves non-Zionist, even though they were giving lots of support to Israel. They still said, I don't really believe in Zionism, but to them, it was more just a practical matter of trying to provide support to, especially in the wake of the Holocaust. I mean, that's the really important context here, that it was so shocking and horrifying that it pushed even non-Zionists to support the Israeli project of creating this new state, Jewish state in Palestine. But most of the labor leaders were like Irish Catholics or Protestants, who, including a lot of the leaders of unions that were purchasing these bonds. There's some funny stories of in the 1960s and 70s of the Teamsters Union, under the leadership of Jimmy Hoffa, a famous Irish American, with alleged ties to the mafia. And he was a huge supporter of the state of Israel as well. Part of it had to do with, it was seen as, at the time in the US, as kind of a liberal cause. To be supportive of Israel was meant to be supportive of Jewish people more broadly, and against anti-Semitism. So a lot of labor leaders very publicly showed support for Israel, or made a public event out of purchasing State of Israel bonds, having these big fundraiser dinners with celebrities and politicians showing up, as a way of signaling to the public that they were very liberal, that they were because again, Israel was seen as like this liberal cause at the time, but very few of these labor leaders were actually Jewish. And again, even the Jewish ones didn't consider themselves Zionists.
The end of the Second World War was, in a way, the beginning of pushing out the radical labor leadership out of the US labor movement. So this was the period of McCarthyism, and the labor movement increasingly became more and more conservative, and that led up to the support of the labor leadership of the US imperialism in Vietnam. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, about the labor movement becoming more conservative at the wake of the Cold War and its relationship to US imperialism in general?
Yeah, so kind of at the heart of that, of what you're describing of the U.S. labor movement becoming more conservative at the dawn of the Cold War was anti-communism. Um, Throughout the history of the U.S. labor movement, going back to the 1800s, there's always been a kind of tension between the more left-wing, more radical, or more visionary types of labor unions and labor leaders and organizers, and the more conservative, or they might see themselves as pragmatic or practical types of union organizers and leaders. You mentioned before the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, which especially in the early 20th century was a very left-wing, union movement that wanted to abolish capitalism and, bring about a completely new society. And in contrast, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, which was the more conservative labor federation, believed that capitalism was just fine as long as workers could have a seat at the table, as long as unions could get their piece of the pie. And so that tension was always there. But in the 1930s and 40s, during the period of the Great Depression, the New Deal, the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, World War II, the Communist Party in the US became very popular because the communists were doing actual practical organizing, trying to respond to the crisis of the Depression. They were organizing workers in industries that were often ignored by the AFL. So by this point, the
So,
IWW, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, also in the South, where there were agrarian labor, right? I'm thinking about Kelly's hammer and hoe.
Right. A lot of black rural sharecroppers, tenant farmers, who were highly exploited workers and had always been ignored by the mainstream labor movement, by the AFL, but the communists were actively organizing them, as well as like Latino or Mexican American farm workers and cannery workers in the Southwest of the United States. And so, in many ways, by this point, the 1930s, 40s, the IWW was kind of in decline because during World War I, there had been this massive state repression against the IWW. And in many ways, the Communist Party kind of took the place of the IWW as the radical left wing section of the labor movement. And the communists, particularly through the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was founded in 1935 and became a real powerful rival to the AFL. The CIO included unions like the United Auto Workers, which unionized the big auto companies like GM and Ford and Chrysler. And the CIO also included the United Steel Workers, which organized the U.S. Steel Corporation and other steel companies, major organizing victories in the 1930s. And the CIO had welcomed in communist organizers, communist trade unionists, whereas the AFL had always shunned them. So throughout the 30s and 40s, early 40s, communists were actually kind of making inroads in the labor movement in uh, becoming somewhat more mainstream and actually organizing many unions and many mass industries that had previously been non-unionized, unorganized. So once World War II ended and the Soviet Union and the US started to become rivals instead of allies as they were during the war, allies united against the Nazis. Um, politics started shifting more to the right in the US. There had been, all these years of progressive reform under Franklin Roosevelt with the New Deal, a lot of government intervention in the economy during World War II, a lot of strikes happening, especially once World War II ended. It was the largest strike wave in US history. Over 5 million workers in the US went on strike to make sure that they wouldn't lose some of the economic gains they had achieved during the war. And so there was kind of a shift back to a lot of people in the US, especially middle class people, white people, felt like there had been too much change in the previous years of the New Deal and World War II. And it was time to kind of, rein in all these forces of change, including unions. And at the same time, there was this growing paranoia about the fact that the Soviet Union, a communist country, was now seen as the main enemy of the US. And there were many, the Communist Party had been rather influential in the US in the previous years, including in the labor movement. So for like corporate CEOs who wanted to bring about a more conservative political environment, who wanted to crack down on unions, a very easy thing they could do was say, unions are just sort of like a communist conspiracy, or they're connected to the Soviet Union because many of the union leaders happen to be part of the Communist Party. So they can make the allegation that they were really just like the puppets of the Soviet Union. They were foreign agents, basically, trying to sabotage the US economy by going on strike and letting the Soviets have a victory. So yes, this led to a lot of like McCarthyism, accusations, witch hunts in the US government, among people who worked in the government, as well as in the labor movement. And the CIO, the leaders of the CIO basically kicked out 11 communist-led unions, purged the CIO of communists and any other kind of left-wing ideas, and became more conservative as a way of trying to, out of political expediency, basically. They thought this is the easiest way we can stay relevant and continue to have a seat at the table. It was sort of a what some historians have called like a Faustian bargain between labor leaders and the U.S. government to say, we will not be too radical, and we will support the U.S., particularly on issues of foreign policy when it comes to confronting the Soviet Union and confronting communism. We'll go along with that as long as we can continue to have a seat at the table and continue to be considered legitimate, and be accepted by sort of by the mainstream society, by the government in particular. And but that said, there was also, especially within the AFL, much more genuine kind of anti-communism, where they had never accepted left-wing ideas in unions. They had always been opposed to communists in the labor movement. And a lot of the leaders of the AFL in the 1940s, 50s, in their own personal history, they had sort of battled with communists over control of their own unions, and they had kicked communists out of their own unions. So they considered themselves experts at fighting communism, and were very eager to go out into the rest of the world after World War II and try to split labor movements to make sure that communists wouldn't communist parties in countries like France and Italy, or in parts of Latin America and other parts of the world, including in India, would not have too much influence in the eyes of these American unionists who were anti-communists. And naturally, a kind of a partnership developed between these anti-communist AFL officials and the U.S. government, and particularly the CIA, the State Department. They saw the CIA, State Department, U.S. government more broadly saw left-wing communist unions in other countries as a potential threat to U.S. interests, because they could push back against U.S. economic penetration into these other countries and move those countries closer to the Soviet Union, or away from the United States at least, or in a more imperialist direction or anti-capitalist direction. And the US government didn't want to see that happen. They wanted to make sure that unions in other countries were pro-US, pro-capitalist. And so the AFL and eventually the AFL-CIO, once the AFL and CIO merged in 1955, became partners of the US government in going overseas and setting up like educational institutes for foreign trade unionists in other countries, teaching them the ways of the more conservative kind of unionism practice in the US, of saying, you don't want to be too radical, you don't want to challenge the system, you just want to bargain over better wages and better conditions. And not only that, but also sometimes funneling money from the CIA to uh, foreign worker organizations. A great example is in Chile in the early 1970s during the presidency of Salvador Allende, socialists. And the US government, of course, wanted to completely undermine his presidency and eventually laid the groundwork for a military coup in 1973, the very famous coup of September 11th, 1973, or infamous, I should say. But in the run up to that, some of the worker organizations of like more middle class workers, the shopkeepers and truckers in particular, physicians and others, but a lot of transportation workers were staging these big strikes, shutting down the whole Chilean economy and really destroying the President Allende's political credibility because the economy was in such tatters because of these big strikes. But the money to support these strikes, like when the workers were not working, the way they could keep feeding themselves and keeping a roof over their heads, there was money being funneled from the CIA and from the State Department through the AFL-CIO to some of these more conservative worker organizations. And there were other examples of things like that in other countries as well throughout the Cold War period. It's a really big and long history, and there's many examples, but that's just again, another snapshot.
I want to jump a little bit to the contemporary moment. A Bloomberg report says that there were 317 work stoppages in the last 3 years in the US, and 485,000 workers have been involved in strikes and demonstrations. Tell us a little bit about the new surge of unionization that we have seen, but also place that in the context of increasingly more and more unions coming out in support of the ceasefire and standing with the Palestinian solidarity movement.
So a little of the context of since the 1970s and 80s, the US labor movement has been in a steep decline because of deindustrialization and globalization and the rise of right-wing political movements like the presidency of Ronald Reagan, most famously in the 1980s, and other factors like that, extreme union busting by corporations. But so yeah, unions have been going downhill and have been shrinking for many years in the US. But in the last few years, as you mentioned, there's been something of another resurgence. I think you mentioned earlier, and I think you said Professor Wolf talked about this, how the labor movement there's been like different waves of growth and decline, and then more growth and decline. And we're currently in a period of growth again, or at least rejuvenation, renewed energy, led by a lot of younger people who have grown up in the last 40, within this period of the last 40 years, where the working class has seen its prospects really go down, and where economic inequality has risen dramatically, where the younger generation is economically worse off than their parents' generation, where many Americans are in debt, student debt from going to college, and the only jobs they can get pay very low wages and very abusive bosses. So I think that combined with the kind of rejuvenated left-wing movement, socialist movement of the last several years, which has been illustrated by like the campaigns of Senator Bernie Sanders when he ran for president in 2016 and 2020, openly as a socialist, which that hadn't happened in the U.S. before for a very long time, for almost 100 years, where you had an openly socialist presidential candidate who was very popular and got lots of support from millions of people. Um, as well as the growth of organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America, movements like the Occupy Wall Street movement back in 2011, protesting the greed and corruption of Wall Street and the financial sector. A lot of these things all taken together has just meant that there's working class people in the U.S. are fed up with all this mistreatment, all this inequality, and I think the pandemic even further fueled that, where a lot of people were in low wage jobs were being told they were essential and had to keep going to work, even though they were being paid minimum wage. They didn't even have any kind of benefits or paid leave, and literally risking their lives for these low wage jobs because they were exposed to the virus. This was before there was any vaccine or any treatment for COVID. And other groups of workers who were able to switch to working from home, and they started asking, well, why can't it always be like this? Why do I have to um, go into some office and sit there for 8 hours a day or whatever? So there was a lot of, I think the pandemic also played a role in getting a lot of working class people to rethink things and to be more willing to speak up for themselves and for their coworkers. Um, so yeah, in the last couple of years, we've seen um, a lot of workers in a lot of teacher unions going on strike to demand not only better pay and conditions for themselves, but more investment in schools, more investment from the government in education to make sure students have a good learning experience, that they have their textbooks, that they have decent classrooms that they can sit in. Unions of what else? Earlier this year, there was almost a strike by UPS delivery drivers with the Teamsters Union. There have been Starbucks workers, baristas at the coffee shops who have been organizing and winning union elections, still fighting against the company, which has been engaged in relentless union busting, breaking the law, refusing to negotiate a contract with them. Similarly, workers at Amazon warehouses going on strike and organizing. The Amazon Labor Union won its union election a couple years ago in New York City. And then this year, the United Auto Workers, under new leadership, went on strike at the big three U.S. automakers, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, and won a big victory there. There have been college professors and graduate teaching assistants unionizing and going on strike all over the country. So all of this, I think, is part of the fact, again, that people are kind of fed up, and the pandemic also pushed that. And but a lot of it is driven by a younger generation, and there's a very mobilized rank and file who are, it's not just about wages and conditions, but they also understand the broader problems of the political economy in the United States and around the world, the problems of neoliberalism, the problems of a kind of extreme capitalism, the threat of extreme right-wing movements and fascist movements, not only in the US, but all around the world. So there's also this more politicized um, generation of working class people in the US. As I mentioned, a lot of them are college educated. They went to college and got a degree and learned all kinds of things about our society and our economy, and then went to work in low wage menial jobs because there was no other opportunities for them, and now they're stuck in student debt. So there's also kind of a political vision behind this rejuvenated labor movement. And
This is perhaps why the conservative movement is so paranoid about politics within the college in the US.
exactly, because it is waking people up to the realities uh, of the realities of capitalism, of imperialism, of racism and sexism, et cetera. Um, and also, the working class in the U.S. is more diverse than it ever has been before, more racially and ethnically diverse, more religiously diverse, more different nationalities, different gender identities, sexual orientations, and so on, which also I think is part of this. So So when something like, this unfolding ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza starts to happen, this more politically conscious, diverse, militant working class in the US, which is driving this rejuvenated labor movement, of course they're going to speak out about it. Of course they're going to have, especially when the US government is fueling and funding so much of this by sending all these weapons, all this money, and providing all this political support to Israel. Of course, workers in the US are going to be concerned and speak out about it. And because they have many of them, not enough, but many have unions that they're part of. They can, through their unions, have express a call for an end to the violence, for a ceasefire as the bare minimum. And so there have been, or since October, um, you know, I don't know how many now, but scores of unions at the local, state, regional, national level, including the United Auto Workers, including the UE, United Electrical Workers, which is one of those left-wing unions that was pushed out of the CIO way back in 1949, but has survived all these years as a small independent union. The UE was one of the first unions to put out a call for a ceasefire, and the UE has also gone farther than that and has endorsed the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and has called for the U.S. government to end its unconditional military aid to Israel. As well, other unions have called for a ceasefire. The healthcare, nurses unions, many teacher unions, many unions of academic workers at universities, unions of building trades workers, hospitality workers, dock workers, etc. Um, and so yeah, I think it does go. A great example is United Auto Workers, where it was a rank and file movement within that union that a couple of years ago successfully changed the union's constitution so that the union president and other top leaders can be directly elected by the membership through the principle of one person, one vote, or one member, one vote. Because before, the president of the union was chosen just by delegates at the national convention of the union, but they changed the constitution so that every member could vote on who the president was. And then this past March, they elected Shawn Fain. He was the first ever democratically elected president of the union, as Shawn Fain is a kind of a progressive reformer who promised to take on the big auto companies, which he did, not him alone, of course, with the membership, by going on strike this fall. Um, and so the same movement of rank and file members who elected Shawn Fain have also been calling for a ceasefire, calling on him and the union leadership at the UAW to call for a ceasefire. And that's why Shawn Fain and the UAW leadership finally did, I think on December 1st, announced that they were calling for a ceasefire, because it came from the pressure from below, from the rank and file. And it's because they have a democratic union now and a leadership that's actually responsive to the rank and file that was able to happen.
When we talk to the international left, especially people in the global south, about some of the optimisms, very cyclical in nature, about the US labor movement, people usually respond by saying that, well, there are these silver linings that we see, but eventually nothing manifests in the United States. And as we speak about these more radical or progressive turns within the labor movement, a lot of national labor unions, including the AFL-CIO leadership, has not endorsed the ceasefire. At best, they are talking about a humanitarian pause, which is the New York Times line, the horrendous November 3rd opinion piece. How optimistic are you about the whole thing that is going on?
I think there's a lot of work that still has to be done. I mean, I'm a historian, so I have to always put things into the context of the history. So yes, the AFL-CIO leadership is still refusing to call for a ceasefire, and many of the big national unions their leaders are refusing to call for a ceasefire. And again, a ceasefire is really the bare minimum, right? It would be better to see more and more unions not only calling for a ceasefire, but talking about BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, talking about calling on the U.S. government to end military aid to Israel, and speaking more openly in solidarity with the Palestinian liberation movement. I think that's more ideal of what we on the left would want to see the U.S. labor movement doing. But instead, we kind of the most we're seeing is a call for a ceasefire, and there are many union leaders, labor officials that won't even do that. But the history, right? I talked about how the U.S. labor movement has always been one of the strongest supporters of the state of Israel and of Zionism for over a century now. And so in that context, the calls for a ceasefire are significant because it shows the beginning and kind of cracks in the foundation of this longstanding support for Israel, that it's beginning to break apart a little bit. And I think it's the job of organizers in the labor movement, left organizers, to keep kind of hammering away at those cracks until it finally shatters, and we can have a labor movement that takes these more powerful stances in terms of talking about boycotting, divesting, ending military aid, and more than that, even shutting down military production or transportation of military, hardware to Israel. Unions, workers obviously can play a huge role in shutting down the war machine, quite literally. But we're not there yet, for the most part, unfortunately. But that's because of this long history of support for Zionism and support for Israel, as well as this related long history of the U.S. labor movement supporting U.S. imperialism and being tied up with the State Department and the CIA and other entities of the U.S. government. But it's significant that there's at least a start to this, that there is a vision, that there are the conversations happening. There are some unions and union members, caucuses of rank and filers within unions that are talking about more than just a ceasefire. They're talking about these other things, stronger ways of supporting Palestine, and talking about why it's important for unions to have their own kind of independent politics, independent of the Democratic Party, which they've traditionally been allied with. And that includes an independent foreign policy. So I think there is cause for optimism, because there have been changes in the United States, in the simple sense of the United States social, political, economics atmosphere has transformed many times throughout history because of working class movements. This is how slavery finally came to an end in the 19th century in the U.S. It was because of enslaved Black workers rebelling and walking off the job, so to speak, running away from the plantations, joining the Union Army and fighting against the Confederates themselves. And it's how in the early 20th century, the things like the 8-hour workday, the abolition of child labor, minimum wage, the right to be able to have a union and to organize, these things were achieved through lots of organizing, lots of struggles and strikes, and
martyrdom
as well. Yeah. And in more recent, well, I say recent, but in the last, 50, 60 years, the end of Jim Crow segregation in the South, the end of the more, I guess, overt forms of racism and sexism. Of course, there's still racism and sexism, but it's not as like overt and official and sanctioned. There's actually like laws and there's protections now around different forms of discrimination. All of these things, these are all improvements that have been made. It took a lot of time and a lot of effort and struggle, and violence was involved. Often, repression was involved, but these victories were achieved. So that's always, so we're kind of in another one of these moments where there's all of these different interconnected fights for for social justice and economic justice of working class people, trying to have more dignity on the job, trying to be able to have basic economic security, taking on these extremely powerful corporations and financial interests, taking on this fascist movement that's been growing. And, you know, a central part of that, I think, is the struggle for Palestinian freedom and the ability to be able to speak out against the genocide that's happening in Gaza. An important first step to call for a ceasefire, and the fact that so many unions are doing it is good, but it shouldn't be just like that shouldn't be considered a victory in itself. It should be considered the first step in opening up space for more conversations and more organizing to keep pushing it further.
A lot of people say that the working class in the US has had a big leverage within the American politics in terms of bringing about progressive change. But when it comes to foreign policy in particular, they say that the US state machinery is extremely non-responsive to what the labor does. And perhaps with the one exception of the the anti-Vietnam War demonstration, but even there, some people say that it was more about the rebellion within the elites, particularly within the military and the armed forces, that were more significant than these demonstrations by ordinary working people. What's your response to that?
Yeah, it's true that we have in the United States, a very undemocratic foreign policy where, especially over the last few decades during the Cold War and afterwards, foreign policy is more and more controlled just by the president, just by the White House, and even Congress not having much say in that. Um, the the history of the anti-Vietnam War movement is significant, and there was a lot of working class people, union members who were opposed to the war. A lot of that actually gets forgotten today because unions like or union the Labor Federation, the AFL-CIO, and its leaders were very much in favor of the war, and so were some other conservative union leaders because of their traditional ties to U.S. imperialism and their anti-communist beliefs. So it often gets remembered that, or sort of misremembered, that unions were completely in support of the war, but it was the reality was a lot more complicated than that, since it was kind of a division within the labor movement, in the same way that there's sort of divisions in the labor movement today about Israel and Palestine. But uh, sorry, I forgot the question now.
Does the labor movement basically translate into foreign policy? While it's very clear that the labor movement translates into a Keynesian state, a welfare state, but it is often said that when it comes to foreign policy, the labor movement just is helpless.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we haven't really had much of a chance to see, because for so long the labor movement, at least at the top levels, has been totally supportive of U.S. foreign policy. Uh, it's very rare for the AFL-CIO, being the major labor federation, kind of the official voice of the labor movement, has never really been against U.S. militarism or imperialism. The only example is in 2005 at the AFL-CIO's convention, they passed a resolution that called for an end to the Iraq War. That's the only time that the AFL-CIO has ever been actually officially against a U.S. war. So there hasn't been a lot of chances to see. Um, but I think the U.S. labor can have an important role in foreign policy, particularly when it comes to the military-industrial complex and these weapons manufacturers, companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and General Dynamics, which supply missiles and munitions, and they make F-15 fighter jets or F-35 fighter jets. And a lot of the weapons being used by Israel, but also get used by other countries and get used by the United States military itself, obviously. A lot of these companies, their workers are unionized, with the United Auto Workers or with the International Association of Machinists and others. So they're well positioned to shut down the war machine and have a real impact. And I wrote about in an article recently in Jewish Currents, an article called "The Problem of the Unionized War Machine," about how in the 1960s and 70s and 80s there were some union leaders and people in the labor movement who talked about uh, conversion away from military production and having those jobs that currently involved, making all these weapons and bombs, uh, converting them to that they'd be making other things, producing socially useful products like medical equipment or green energy systems, solar panels and wind turbines or whatever. Um, this is something that has traditionally been called conversion, converting from a war economy to a peace economy. But in recent times, it's more and more that the term just transition gets used a lot when speaking about the transition away from fossil fuels to a green energy economy and making sure that the people who work in the fossil fuel related industries are not left behind and that their communities are not left behind, that they can have retraining and they can have economic support if they're unemployed for a period of time, and they can have other new opportunities, good paying union jobs in a more carbon neutral, clean economy. That same idea, but using it when it comes to the weapons industry, having a just transition or a conversion away from a war-oriented economy to a more peace-oriented economy. This is really important in the US because part of why we have such a militaristic foreign policy and why we have the largest military by far in the world is because it can be justified on the grounds that this is providing jobs to people in different communities. And for members of Congress, if they have like a weapons factory in their district, it's very hard for them to be against militarism, because if they are, then that means their own voters, their own constituents are going to lose their jobs if, the weapons factory in their district shuts down. So there needs to be a way around that. And I think more discussions and planning around economic conversion or just transition, which unions could play a powerful role in advocating for that and organizing around that, is something that could be done. And also transportation workers who transport a lot of the military supplies, whether on the trains or trucks or through shipping, and dock workers are at a strategic locations within the global economy to be able to shut things down. The International Longshore and Warehouse Union in the United States, the ILWU, which is another one of those left-wing unions that was kicked out of the CIO in 1950 during the anti-communist purges. The ILWU, throughout its history, this is dock workers along the west coast of the U.S., have frequently refused to handle cargo for countries that are involved in imperialism or colonialism or apartheid. They boycotted cargo from South Africa. They've also boycotted on a couple occasions Israeli shipping, Israeli commercial ships. So there's that aspect as well, that labor, dock workers or transport workers can shut down or at least disrupt, slow down the movement of military equipment, or have pressure on foreign policy in those ways. And then the fact that it's a little bit more basic, but so much of the labor movement mobilizes voters for Democrats usually, particularly Joe Biden. I think he wouldn't have won in 2020 if it hadn't been for thousands of rank and file union members in key states like Georgia and Arizona and Michigan going around knocking on doors, telling voters, vote for Biden. So because of that relationship between U.S. labor and the Democratic Party, if labor leaders actually did start speaking out against U.S. foreign policy, imperialistic foreign policy, or militarism, but which they usually don't do, that's the problem. But if they actually did, maybe at least Democrats would have to listen to them if they want to get reelected. That's the problem that Joe Biden is facing right now. where he's it's not looking very good for him right now, and a lot of that is because of his support for Israel and his support for this genocide, and many voters in the US are not happy about that. And the fact that his own allies, Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, Biden has done a couple of events with him. Biden went to a UAW picket line when they were on strike, the first U.S. sitting president to actually join a picket line. And now Sean Fain is saying, President Biden, call for a ceasefire. So it makes Biden much more isolated politically when he wants to present himself as the most pro-union president in history and a friend to the labor movement. And many of the most dynamic voices in the labor movement are telling him to call for a ceasefire, even though, yes, the AFL-CIO is not saying that, and a lot of other labor leaders are not. But the fact that there are union leaders, the UAW, the American Postal Workers Union, the UE, the National Nurses United, and just recently I saw the Flight Attendants Union, Association of Flight Attendants, whose leader, Sarah Nelson, is another very outspoken, well-respected labor leader. They recently joined the calls for a ceasefire as well. So Biden is becoming more politically isolated. And this is just an example of how if labor leaders actually did speak out against U.S. foreign policy, it could have a direct impact, at least on Democratic elected officials. But the problem is traditionally they have not spoken out against U.S. foreign policy. They've only supported it.
I'm letting you go with this last very quick question. A lot of our viewers ask us where to look for what are the sources if one has to look at the US labor movement, what goes on, because even about the US labor movement condemning what's going on in Palestine, the liberal press, the New York Times, the Washington Post is completely silent. I mean, people like Professor Khalid Rashidi has been mentioning about the labor movement and its support for the Palestinian cause. You have been writing extensively, but not the mainstream press. So where should one look at for sources?
There's Labor Notes, which is a website, and it's an organizing project of rank and file union members that are often writing about uh, about labor struggles in the U.S. So it's called Labor Notes. There's In These Times, progressive magazine that I often write for, that has great coverage of the labor movement. There's Jacobin, socialist left-wing publication that also writes a lot about the labor movement. Jacobin's labor reporter Alex Press is really great. There's the Real News Network, which publishes a lot of great articles. Maximilian Alvarez is the editor-in-chief over there, and he writes great articles. He does a lot of fantastic interviews and podcasts with union members. Truth Out is another progressive left-wing pro-labor publication in the U.S. So those what. So again, Labor Notes, In These Times, Jacobin, the Real News Network, and what did I say? I already forgot. Truth Out, and reporters like Luis Feliz Leon and Kim Kelly. I mentioned Alex Press, Maximilian Alvarez, uh, myself, and numerous others. I know I'm forgetting a lot, but those are some great sources.
Professor Schuhrke, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.